gluten-free diets, and we're going to be answering questions on gluten-free. So, welcome. I'm James Marin, Integrative Registered Dietitian, Environmental Nutritionist.
I'm Dahlia Marin, Integrative Gut Health Dietitian. We're excited to do another live talk about this topic. It's a very prevalent topic and one that we get asked of very frequently. So if you all have questions about gluten, we're going to be answering all those questions. And we know you guys like to ask other questions, and we encourage you to check out our YouTube because on there we've had tons of other topics.
Yes.
So hopefully today we'll talk mostly about gluten, and then we'll be able to answer all your burning questions on it.
So yes, so if you're joining gluten-free, this is live and it will be recorded. Check out our YouTube for the full recording, and you can comment, like, share, subscribe, all those good things there. So let's get into it. And we're seeing some comments come in. We can see your comments, whether you're on Facebook, YouTube, or Instagram. Happy Friday, Marcy. Cool. We are excited to get into this. Now, we do already have some questions from our Good Gut members. Our Good Gut members are people usually in our practice, but you don't have to be. You can become a Good Gut member and you get unlimited questions. You get access to our SIBO IBS group. And we're excited, guys. Make sure you're on our newsletter, our email list, which you can find at marriedtohealth.com. We're going to be dropping our wait list soon for our SIBO IBS program. We have a lot of great things coming. And yeah, we're excited to dive into gluten. Oh my gosh. I mean, who isn't talking about gluten at some point, at one point? Crazy statistics were about 20 to 30% of the entire population has at one point been on a gluten-free diet. That's a pretty crazy statistic. I think it's one of the most prevalent and popular diets out there. And again, and for the most part, we think of it with celiac disease. We think of it with gluten sensitivity. We hear autoimmune. We hear good, and we hear good about wheat. We hear bad about wheat. So we want to answer your questions, and we have some great questions lined up.
And I think to open up this topic, it's so important because I hear this a lot. People aren't even familiar with what gluten is.
Yeah.
I think people assume that they should follow a gluten diet, that gluten diets are healthier, that if you have gut issues, you have to be gluten-free. But I do feel like there's a small percentage of people who are very well versed in what gluten actually is and why going gluten-free might confer any relief or any benefits on the gut. So, to intro this topic, gluten is a protein, and it is a type of protein peptide that is found in wheat, barley, and rye. And protein peptides, I always like to think of them as little pearls on a necklace. So gluten is one of these different types of protein peptides that can be in those specific grains. And, there's other components as well. There's things like gliadin, glutenin. All of these make this little necklace, if you will, of protein chains that can just make some of these different grains a little bit more involved in breaking down and in digesting through our gut microbes and through the digestive process. So gluten, again, is a protein. And I think the reason why so many people have demonized gluten or even feared gluten over the years is because it can be a protein that in certain forms could be a little bit harder to digest, a little bit harder to break down, and is one that involves more of your gut bugs and good gut balance, good gut flow, and good gut structure in order for most people to feel really amazing when they're eating gluten. So if you're somebody who says, I'm not celiac, but I feel better not eating gluten and I want to know why, that's what we're going to be talking about today.
Yes. Wonderful. Should we get right into a question?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. First question. Are there big differences in the guidelines, for example, for those eating gluten/grains who don't have gut issues and those of us that do? So another way to phrase that question that came in, basically, if you have gut issues, are there different guidelines, recommendations versus if you don't have gut issues, what are the recommendations with gluten-containing grains? So wonderful question. Many layers to this question. We'll kind of go over them a little bit quickly so we can get to as many questions as possible. But First, I think maybe let's start with those who don't have gut issues. I fall into that category. I don't really have gut issues. Yeah, I get a little constipated when I travel. Yeah, I might get a little bloated if I'm eating too quickly, or like if I go out to a restaurant that I normally don't go to and I'm eating more oil and salt and maybe there's added sugar I'm not aware of. There's times I'm at restaurants, like Thai food comes to mind, and we're traveling or with family and I'm like, oh, I'm burping more or like passing gas a little bit more,
It's pretty normal though.
feeling bored. But yeah, but overall burping, passing gas is normal
On a regular
on a
basis.
regular basis. But if you're noticing it more than usual, you're like, what kind of happened?
But day
But
to day, James
right,
doesn't have gut issues. He's never
right.
at home, usually bloated, gassy. Even most of the time when we go out to eat, when we're
I'm
traveling, he's
I'm
fine.
good.
Um,
So with that, I do have gluten every once in a while, and I do pretty well. I never eat gluten. For example, at our church, they give what's called orban, and it's gluten. It's really like the most glutinous gluten
a high
you
gluten
can
bread.
think of. So, and I eat that, and I'm fine. Whereas maybe there's times Dahlia will eat that, and she's not. She's like, "Ooh, I can feel that." Pretty. I mean, what would
Mhm.
you say, right away, or
Yeah,
anyway?
yeah. Within about 24 hours of
Right.
consuming it, I don't feel well. But you guys know I have a history of long-standing gut issues, pretty much from the womb. I've had gut
Right.
issues, so I don't tolerate gluten. I have an autoimmune condition. I do have leaky gut that I'm still actively working on to this day. So I personally, anecdotally, I don't eat gluten because I don't feel well when I have gluten. I know I don't have celiac disease. I've tested negative for celiac disease on blood test, even though, you really want to test through an endoscopy, but
Mhm.
I don't do well with gluten. So
So
let's talk about, the
so long
guidelines
Yeah,
recommendations.
so recommendations guidelines for a healthy person, usually servings of 3 to 5 whole grains. Those could be gluten containing grains. Now, also, there are gluten free whole grains that you can get: quinoa, sorghum, teff. These are also
Millet.
very nutrient rich and great to have. So you can
Mhm.
eat whole grains. Normal, healthy person, go for it, eat it. I would add another recommendation. This isn't a guideline. This is just our personal recommendation based on some of the latest research. I do try to get organic or just the least sprayed whole grains as possible. That's something I'd recommend. But overall, even if it's not organic, you could still eat whole grains and do really well.
And 3 to 5 servings, for those of you who are wondering what's a serving of grains,
Hmm.
a serving of bread, for example, is a slice of toast. A couple of those small, like taco sized tortillas, those are a serving of those tortillas. And one of the larger wheat tortillas, that would be a serving of grain that in that form because it's thinner. And then a third to a half cup of a grain like rice or oats
Hmm.
or quinoa or amaranth, millet, sorghum, buckwheat, one of those things. That's a serving. So whether you're gluten free like me, or whether you're gluten eater like James, you should still be really shooting to get those 3 to 5 servings of whole grains per day. And that is because whole grains, whether they're gluten containing whole grains or gluten free whole grains, they're still really nutrient dense. So
Hmm.
it's super important for you to be trying your best to include as many gluten free whole grains, whether you're gluten free or you're eating gluten, because they are going to provide you with zinc, iron, healthy complex carbohydrates, fiber, so many more trace minerals, and so many more trace nutrients. So, super important for you guys to still be shooting for those 3 to 5 servings per day.
And I'm a good example of someone who lives in a fairly gluten-free household. So I eat a lot of whole grain, gluten-free grains, and I still do just fine. So I'm not always eating tons of wheat or wheat bread or rye or things like that. I'm for the most part I'm doing a lot of brown rice, forbidden rice, quinoa, and I love teff and millet and all those other gluten-free whole grains. So I really enjoy that. Great question. Another to add, now going on the side of those with gut issues, FODMAPs. I mean, something I've talked about is FODMAPs. And FODMAPs, we want to say, are good. You want to eat FODMAPs. However, in the context of gut issues, IBS, SIBO, all these things, there can be an indication of a low FODMAP plan, or and it
Mhm.
has to be a plan. And why I say a low FODMAP plan is you're strategic with it, you know what you're doing, you're working with someone like Dahlia, or someone else on your care team who really understands what they're doing and knows how to help you with a low FODMAP plan. All right. You're not just willy-nilly going, yeah, I'm going to try low FODMAP and be on it for a month, 6 months. And we've heard of patients on it for years. So that's not what it's intended to do or be. So yes.
Yeah. And, as far as gluten goes, like we're saying, there is a difference between those who have celiac, which is 1 to 2% of the world's population, versus those who don't. But there are studies that show that anywhere from 12% of people to up to 20% of people in some studies will report experiencing digestive symptoms after they do consume gluten. So these are non-celiacs who are reporting this. We do know with celiac, it is an autoimmune condition. So the immune system starts to really inflame and irritate and attack the lining of the small intestine, the lining of the villi, and that can cause them to flatten and get damaged. And then that affects the ability for those with celiac disease to absorb nutrition from their food. That's not necessarily what's happening in somebody who's reporting that they have non-celiac gluten sensitivity. Somebody who has non-celiac gluten sensitivity, they're not experiencing that damage in the lining of their intestines. And it's not an autoimmune reaction when people are consuming these gluten proteins, but they could, again, like me, experience different things, especially if, like me, somebody is dealing with leaky gut. So, some things that are usually reported are things like bloat. So that could be a very common report. As James was saying, we'll get into this very deeply with the research, but usually that is because of the FODMAP that's in the gluten and or in the wheat rather, and not necessarily the gluten protein itself. So that could be from FODMAP in wheat. But bloat could happen, abdominal discomfort, diarrhea or constipation. Some of my patients might report joint pain. Some people say they become brain fog or they have brain fog, they become very fatigued. So all these things could be indicators that your body is responding to this. If you're not someone who has celiac, but maybe you again say, I have leaky gut, it could be because of these gluten proteins, which are larger and a little bit more complex to break down and digest. They're just larger protein molecules, and they're making their way through the not supposed to be permeable, but can become permeable gut lining. And so now you have these large protein molecules in your bloodstream that your immune system does not like there. It's like, hey, what's this? You don't belong here. I'm going to go after you.
So that's great. I mean, so another question, I see things saying that gluten/wheat causes leaky gut in everyone, and then some saying there's no need to avoid it if you don't have celiac disease, which is true. So you're kind of touching on this leakiness of the gut, and to say gluten causes, that's not entirely accurate, but it can if you're already experiencing leaky gut. I also see more comments. I think a lot of people can relate to this. My granddaughter has physical tics when eating gluten. They subside when staying off gluten. That can relate to leakiness of the gut. It's not that the gluten is causing the physical tics, or it can cause eczema, skin reactions, inflammation. I mean, you name it, just a whole cascade of reactions all across the body, which you're like, wow, that's related to gluten. And you'll hear friends and family, we hear it from patients and across the board of going, I stopped eating gluten and then I saw this fill in the blank change, right? Like you're sharing right here about your granddaughter, which is great. Now that speaks to the leakiness of your gut. It's gluten proteins are crossing barriers they're not supposed to be crossing and activating your immune system in ways they're not supposed to be activating. And your body's really symptoms, like we say, symptoms are a blessing. They're really just trying to tell you something that's happening in your body. It's your body trying to adjust, rebalance, and react to something that's really not supposed to be happening. So it's important to understand your symptoms, and then you can dive a little bit deeper and go, oh, that's why that's happening. I think this is my maybe chance to give a little bit more context. We're seeing this happen because for decades, if not hundreds of years, wheat and gluten containing grains and a lot of grains in general, we've been hybridizing, we've been selectively breeding. And unfortunately, we've been selectively breeding and hybridizing grains, not to say, how are we going to make them healthier for people's gut microbiomes? Or how are we going to make them amazing for the health and public health of our society, especially when it comes to the grains in the US? We've been going, how are we going to make them cheaper, faster, more transportable so we can export them? How are we going to selectively breed them to do what we want them to do to make money, not for the public health? A lot of times those things don't align very well. So we're seeing agricultural practices that lead to fungal overgrowths in grains. We're seeing pesticide use and herbicide use in grains. And we're seeing a lot of import export practices that facilitate more, yeah, just more kind of toxins or cross contamination. There's lots of studies on this. There's lots of reporting on this. So it's being very, very careful. The main reason for this is that grains are dried. And when you look at fresh green wheat, we're not picking it when it's fresh and green. We're picking it when it's dried. It's one of the grains, or I mean, that's the commonality with grains and even pulses, of where we're drying them and we're utilizing them dry, right? So there's a process to dry these grains. And when you're thinking of the millions and billions of people needing to be fed with these grains, there's massive, massive storehouses of grains where we're drying, and there's a lot of cross contamination that can happen. That's a whole nother rabbit hole.
Yeah.
But
And
some context.
so I think, James brings to light an
Mhm,
interesting few aspects of gluten, right? It's the variety and the hybridization. And here in the US, we usually are producing high yield, high gluten grains. And like I said, even outside of that gluten protein, the wheat itself is high in fructan. In fact, there was one study that showed that
mhm,
wheat makes up 70% of the fructans in a Western diet. So there's, no wonder if you're somebody who's having GI issues, if you are somebody who has dysbiosis, dysmotility, or gut barrier issues, and then you remove 70% of your fructan intake, that would make sense that you are feeling
mhm,
less bloated, you're feeling less constipated, you're feeling less gassy, you're feeling less uncomfortable. Um, so there are those factors. It's how they're being grown. It's the varieties. It could
mhm,
be, the pesticides that are being sprayed on them that some people could very well react to. Everybody's different and different people could react to different things. It is not outlandish to say you could have a reaction to a pesticide. Um, and then we also know that other things affect the fructan content. Going back to
mhm,
that topic of it, we know that when things are picked and harvested, that affects how much fructan is going to be available in the food. So we do also know how it was harvested. That's going to affect how much fructan is in the food. And they actually did a really interesting study. It was actually one that came out very recently. It was a Norwegian study published in Gastroenterology, and it looked at a small number of people. It was honestly only 59 people in the study, so it wasn't huge. But none of them had celiac disease. And they all found that they found relief with a gluten free diet. So they were
mhm,
acquiring people into this study who said, I feel better eating gluten free. So they randomly assigned them into three different groups, and they gave all of them these muesli bars. And muesli are like oat and nut and seed bars. So one group had gluten in their bar, one group had fructans, and
mhm,
others had nothing. It was a nocebo. They were gluten free, fructan free bars. They ate these for 7 days. And then they actually did a crossover into the different groups until each person had consumed all three types of bars. And what the researchers found was the symptoms of IBS, but especially bloat, were 15% worse after they were eating the fructan muesli bars over the ones with gluten and over the, of course, the placebo, the nocebo bars, where they presumed that there was something in these bars, but there actually wasn't anything in them
mhm,
at all. So again, it goes back to that. When we are sensitive to this, are we sensitive to the gluten protein? Or are we sensitive to this fructan, this carbohydrate that is in the wheat itself? I'm sure many of you could relate because a lot of my patients will tell me this. I can't eat wheat here. But when I go to
Mm,
Europe or when I travel overseas and I'm eating a different variety of wheat, again, there's still gluten in there. I can eat it and I'm fine. Why is that?
mm.
And I think there are factors to it. And I think it goes back to a lot of what we were saying. I
Yeah.
think there's less pesticide that's utilized. I think a lot of the times they're not using this high gluten, high yield wheat. I think in many other countries, they're not mass producing food in the same way, in the same manner that we are, right? Wonder Bread is not like a fluffy, amazing sourdough bread that allowed the yeast to really break down and eat the gluten and even some of the fructans that are present in the bread. So those could be some major differences why somebody, again, who does not have celiac disease, they don't have an autoimmune condition, they simply are reacting to possibly American wheat. So
Mm,
that's something we always encourage people to play around with. We say, if you don't react very well to wheat, see if you can eat fermented sourdough breads and see if you have that same reaction where the fructan and even the gluten proteins have been broken down a little bit more. Somebody else, a microbe, some yeast,
mhm.
and bacteria, they pre-digested and pre-broke down those protein and carbohydrates for you. Were you then a little bit less sensitive to it? And could you then incorporate some triple fermented sourdough? Or somebody's saying, Vicki, one of our amazing dietitians is on here. She said, that's why Amazon started selling Italian and French wheat flours.
Mm.
So interesting things to play around with, different options out there.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, very cool stuff. I mean, lots to say on this. We'll try to get through these questions, and the guys would love seeing your comments as well.
Yes, and good questions.
And good questions. Let's see. Oh, I lost my place. Okay. Yeah. Is there any merit to the grain-free diet, even as a short-term intervention, or is always including whole grains, gluten-free or otherwise, any always better?
Mm.
It's a great question.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, like a grain-free diet, I think there's some merit, especially with Dahlia's demographic. I know we have dietitians in Married to Health on various specialties, but with grain-free, it would be, let's
There's
say,
not
a
a
short
lot of data
term.
on it, you guys. I
Yeah.
did some research. There's honestly not a lot of healthy data on grain-free diets.
Hmm.
We are seeing even diets like the Atkins diet, the keto diet. Somebody's asking, what do you guys think about keto
Oh
foods?
yeah.
There really are not grains involved in a keto diet or very, very, very low percentage. And we do see that there could be an increased risk of cardiovascular disease with these very high fat, high protein, lower fiber, and low grain diets. So
Hmm.
I'm not a huge proponent of grain free diets. I know that there is that autoimmune paleo concept that's out there, which again, I'm someone with an autoimmune condition. So I have guinea pigged a lot of things on myself, and I definitely have done like a plant based AIP before until I knew better, right? And really read the research. And there's not a lot of good data out there on it. So be careful if you're just willy nilly pulling grains out of your diet without really knowing this is exactly what I'm reacting to. I will say, just anecdotally, there's not strong data to support this, but in my practice, I do find that my patients with SIFO or suspected SIFO, because a lot of times they haven't had it confirmed, or that's small intestinal fungal overgrowth of
Hmm.
things like candida and other types of yeast or fungus. Sometimes those patients will struggle a little bit more with grains in general. So sometimes it does require a little bit of work with the care team to really try to balance that out, try to eradicate some of that yeast overgrowth that's suspected or confirmed. And then they often will find once they eradicate the overgrowth, they have less dysbiosis. We're making sure we're working on motility and we work on their gut barrier function. A majority of my patients have been able to reintroduce grains and feel perfectly fine on them. So, it's not always something that I do recommend. And even, with gluten free diets, there was a really great study that came out a few years ago that showed that if somebody's gluten free and they are not including a variety of whole grains, they're simply pulling gluten from their
Mm,
diet and they're eating rice, corn, and oats, which are the
mhm,
three most common gluten free grains, that person might increase their risk for cardiovascular disease. So, this study showed that those who had celiac disease they did actually decrease their risk for cardiovascular disease. But those who are non-celiac and gluten sensitive, who were not including a variety of whole grains, increased their risk for cardiovascular disease. We do know this, that most gluten-free products that people are buying are higher in fat, they're higher in sugar, they cost more. So you want to kind of consider, how is that affecting your health, and how can you include as much variety as you possibly can, whether that's with a gluten-free grain or some form of gluten, like a triple fermented sourdough, one of these European wheat varieties. Somebody's saying, Adriana's saying, I had 2 slices of bread every day for 2 weeks and no issues in the Netherlands. Also, no weight gain. So, yeah, again, maybe identifying, was it because you were moving and walking around when you're on your vacation? Your motility was really great. Was it that, plus the variety of the wheat was one that your body was able to break down and digest a little bit better? Was it the fact that there were no pesticides sprayed on it? Sometimes really getting to the core of these things can liberate your diet more, where you're not feeling like you are necessarily having to be gluten-free just because you find that you're reacting to American wheat. There are other options out there for you to try.
Next question coming in. If you are recovering from SIBO/gut permeability and have suspected inflammation, could it be helpful and supportive to go 100% gluten free? Great question. There was a great study on those with IBS, and they did place them in different cohorts, with those with IBS on a gluten-free diet and those with IBS on a gluten-containing diet. They did find better symptom management with those on a gluten-free diet. So very interesting. We're still in early phases. We're going to look at more studies as they come out. That was a really good one when they did a crossover analysis. They put the group into separate cohorts. And it was interesting to find that those with IBS, and as you know, I say IBS and SIBO interchangeably. Again, not all IBS is SIBO. All SIBO is IBS. So that's why I use IBS as like a bigger umbrella, because the study was not done specifically on SIBO. For those of you like, what are you talking about? Go to our channel, dive deep with us even more. But SIBO is small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. That is under the umbrella of IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, right? So with that, we are finding, or I mean, definitely you can speak on this more, Dalia, but finding those having better symptom management. And again, with IBS, it's usually bloating and gas, and can be a mixture of constipation, diarrhea. But then when the doctor goes in and does the endoscopy, which is going from the mouth, or the colonoscopy going from the rectum, he's going, everything looks great. Like, what are you complaining about? Like, there's, with IBS, it can be very frustrating, and even SIBO, because your gastroenterologist is going, everything looks great. But yet you're going, I'm having these horrible symptoms. My life is not the same because I'm always having to be next to a restroom, or I can't travel like I want to, or I don't sleep enough, and all these different things. So it's very important to address what's going on, and take a bigger and broader look and go, diet definitely plays a factor. There's still a large percentage of gastroenterologists that go, what's SIBO?
40%.
Nutrition doesn't matter. It's like, no, as dietitians and heavily
There
based
are
in the
some
research.
amazing gastros out
Oh
there
yeah.
too. Shout out to, so many that we know, Dr. B, Dr. Mendez, Dr.
Gut,
so
gut
many.
love, yeah.
Yeah.
Who's Gut Love on Instagram. So yeah, they're doing amazing integrative work where they're diving deeper and really helping you get to the root cause. So super, super important to do that and realize diet does play a role. And this is where you don't throw gluten-free out the window going, oh, that's just a fad. It's like, no, it's, again, we're talking about medical nutrition therapy, meaning it has a place, again, with a targeted healthy plan, right? And someone who knows what they're doing with it. They're not just going, yeah, get all your kids on a gluten-free diet, your whole family gluten-free, 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 everything. Meanwhile, you're just increasing more hyper-processed foods in your diet by going gluten-free, and increasing risk for other chronic diseases. So super important.
And, speaking of SIBO and the low FODMAP diet, that the low FODMAP diet doesn't necessarily tell you to go gluten-free. you actually are recommended to avoid the fructans that are in some of these gluten containing grains. So you're recommended to avoid, whole wheat, whole barley, whole rye. But there are certain things allowed that are wheat products on a low FODMAP diet for people to try. You can try fermented sourdough bread. Again, that other microbe, the yeast and other bacteria, if you are adding bacteria to the sourdough, it is eating and breaking down the gluten protein for you. And it breaks down also the FODMAP carbohydrate for you. So low FODMAP doesn't necessarily mean 100% gluten-free. You can also eat vital wheat gluten. That's allowed on the low FODMAP diet. You can eat seitan, which is made out of vital wheat gluten. Again, it's a protein. It's a concentrated protein. There's none of the fructan FODMAP in there. So it's identifying between the two. But we love these questions. And hi, Chuck. Love the comments.
What's up, Chuck?
But yeah, it's I think hard for a lot of people to differentiate between the gluten and the fructans, especially here in the US, because we're just not eating a lot of slow food. Slow food, as in things that are cooked at home, fermented breads. A lot of the times it's just whatever's on the go, quick and easy. And usually those convenience foods, they are high gluten and they are high fructan. And again, if that's 70% of the fructans in the American diet, it is hard to identify if that bloating, that discomfort, that constipation is coming from the fructan carbohydrate or the gluten protein. So it's going to take time and trial and error.
And let us know, guys. Are we talking like, is it like going over your head? You're just like, oh my gosh, what are you saying with all this? But shout out, let us know in the comments. Is it you guys feeling good with this? Or let us know in the comments too. Have you eaten a fermented slow food of some sort? Are you doing anything to kind of slow down? Are you going? I know we're headed to the farmers market this Sunday. Like that's our Sunday ritual. Are you going to the farmers market? Are you eating some sauerkraut? Are you gonna have some kombucha? Sourdough. Like, let us know in the comments below what you like or what you incorporate.
And again, I said I'm mostly gluten-free, but I can eat sourdough and I feel perfectly fine eating it. So that does beg the question. Is it the protein? Is it the fructan? So yeah, we encourage you all, if you don't need to eliminate something from your diet, especially 100%, especially if it's going to lead you to having a poor relationship with food and feel restricted, play around with it and check it out and see. And again, you can test it in certain ways, like doing a food tolerance test where you eliminate it for about 4 weeks and then you slowly start reintroducing it. Maybe you slowly start reintroducing sourdough bread, a quarter of a slice at a time, and working your way up. And you say, okay, I can eat this type of wheat if the protein and the carbohydrates in it have been broken down, and then try to graduate from there. I usually will say to my patients, next step from some sourdough, if you're tolerating sourdough, maybe try out something like a Food for Life Ezekiel tortilla. It's a sprouted tortilla.
Shout out Food for Life.
Yeah.
Love that.
So sprouting is also going to change the structure of the proteins and of the carbohydrates as well. So that could have some fructan in it, that could have some gluten in it, but you're trying it and you're seeing what aspect of the food you're mostly reacting to. It's a morbid analogy, but you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater and just say, I can't eat wheat, I can't eat gluten. You really want to try to isolate and identify, can I have it in any forms? Can I have European wheat? Am I okay with that? What if I try sourdough? What if I try sprouted? How can I reintroduce as much food as I possibly can so that I can continue to feed my good gut bugs a very wide variety of different nutrients?
Perfect. I hope we didn't get disconnected here. Oh man. Okay. Let us know, guys. Sorry, we're having some fun here. Let us know if you could still hear us on Instagram. Hopefully so. We were just gonna wrap up with some great information. Someone said nope. Let's see. Is that on?
All sounds good. Somebody said.
Okay, perfect. Okay, good. So we'll continue. We had a little interruption, but I think one of the last things to speak on is the idea of ancient grains. Okay, perfect. We're still on, and I love someone's comment. Trying millet this weekend. Love it. So we hope we inspired you with millet, with teff, Quinoa, luckily, has gotten popular, but I think millet is kind of permeating that and getting more and more popular as well. So very,
Mhm.
very important. One of the last questions, I think, what about those types of wheat that are being marketed as unadulterated, like kamut, farro, etc.? Is the percent of gliadin and glutenin different in those? Um, Very, very cool. This goes back to what we said and just kind of, I
Mhm.
think, round this out a little bit, where there have been some studies done on ancient grains versus more conventionally grown gluten-containing crops like the wheat we grow in the United States. However, there's huge variables because it's really hard. It's like comparing apples to oranges because a lot of the ancient grains, especially like kamut, for example, there's very strict standards when growing it. It's usually grown regeneratively, it's grown organic, so it's certified organic. So it's really hard to really tease out all the variables because the studies are showing a benefit to kamut and the ancient grains, but we're not yet that I've seen a really good study done comparing like organic US wheat with like the kamut, which we know is organic and higher quality, and putting them head to head. And I think no one really wants to do that study. I think it's, or maybe someone does. I'm hoping they do. That would be really great. And if you come across that study, let me know. I would love to see that. But when I keep an eye out for that, I have not seen that. I have seen kamut and other ancient grains compared to just conventional wheat. And that did show some benefits in terms of like the polyphenol content. And of course, we know it's great for soil health and the soil microbiome because there's less pesticide spraying, there's no glyphosate, and the list can go on and on. So, very, very cool, very interesting. And that would be kind of what we talk about. And when it comes to with reintroduction, which it would be great to start with a kamut. If you've been a person who's like, I haven't touched wheat in 10 years or 15 years or 20 years, I wouldn't recommend you go to like Chick-fil-A and eat one of their buns, right? I wouldn't say start there with that wheat or that type of gluten. I'd say start with a really high quality kamut if you can, and then
Or fermented
reintroduce or fermented, and then
sourdough.
start that reintroduction. But yeah,
Mhm.
and then so many factors go into this: genetics, breeding, environment, and agriculture with the ancient grains. So there is some sound evidence there. Yeah.
But grains alone, I mean, they have actually done some studies that have compared things like different varieties,
Yeah.
trichale, inkhorn, spelt, and
Hmm.
the gluten content does decrease from our traditional durum wheat. Durum wheat is the most common wheat that we're using here, or winter wheat that we use here in the United States. When we compare the gluten content of that, again, they've selectively bred it. So it's high yield, high gluten. So
Right.
it makes sense that there's, almost 1.5 times the gluten in a high wheat, high yield, high gluten grain like durum, as opposed to something like inkhorn or spelt or one of the more ancient grains. So again, if you've identified it is the proteins in them that I'm sensitive to, those have less gluten protein. They also are going to contain less gliadin.
Hmm.
They're also going to contain less of the other components, the other types of proteins that are in wheat, like glutenin and others. So I
Hmm.
think it's something so important for people to experiment with, again, just to have variety.
Okay. I think
We
we've
have some
given you
more
guys. Oh,
questions
we
here.
do. Okay.
Yes, we definitely do. So, um, we are going to
Let's
save the
see.
live. I love that. I love that question. We saw
Yes.
some questions that were coming through from you guys. Somebody was asking, what are some gluten-free products that we do recommend?
Oh,
Good
great
question. I
question.
really love that. Because, we knew some people, they are celiac. Some people are non-celiac gluten sensitive, and maybe they've tried some of these different wheat varieties with
Mm,
different content of protein, and they've tried, the low fructan varieties of wheat, and maybe
mm,
they still don't do well with it. Um, or maybe those other ones are not as
mm.
accessible to them. So we have a couple of our go-tos. I know
Yeah.
that for sure. There are actually, well, I'll kind of go down the line. You could even go yeast free. So I'm going to add
Ooh.
another factor into this. I hadn't really brought this up yet. But again, I mentioned how sometimes my patients with small intestinal fungal overgrowth, candida, they can struggle sometimes with what they perceive as grains, but sometimes they also find they don't do well with yeasty breads. So we know something like a
Mm,
beautiful bubbly focaccia bread. There's a lot of yeast in there. That's what creates all those beautiful bubbles. A bagel, a beautifully risen pizza dough, something like that. There's a lot of yeast that's put into these things. And again, that's what creates these bubbles and these peaks. Sometimes it's looking at a yeast-free product. So there are a couple that are out there. Shout out to Simple Needs. Simple Needs is a completely gluten-free company. They make gluten-free breads, but they also have some that are yeast-free. So if you're looking for a yeast-free bread, I think their raisin bread is yeast-free. But all of their breads, they have other flavors that have some yeast that are gluten-free. There's Plentiful Kitchen as well, who is a yeast-free bread. And so that could be a good
Wait,
option as
before
well.
Dahlia continues, so just so you know, if you go on our website, marriedtalk.com, under the shop tab, you'll find our Good Gut guide, shopping guide. So a lot of these products will be here.
Are in there.
Go ahead.
You also can find in our guide and other places. You know, we do really like brands like AWG. AWG is another, they're a grain-free bakery, gluten-free as well. So we do like AWG. Happy Campers is one that is more commonly found, more affordable. So Happy Campers is another gluten-free product if you're looking for that. You know, there are others out there. We've tried a lot of them, but I will say those are probably some of our absolute favorites. So if you're really looking for some that are high quality, and then, you know, if you are trying to play around with wheat, we do recommend find a really good sourdough. If you can find a really good organic sourdough, there are a lot out there. And then we do like Food for Life because they do have sprouted, they use sprouted wheat. So a lot of times, again, my patients tell me, and, you know, James, you even find you do okay with their sprouted wheat flakes, and they're very well tolerated.
Yeah.
Okay.
Very cool.
Perfect.
Do you want to, we usually tap out now, but we can keep going.
Yeah, let's answer a couple more questions.
Let's do it.
So somebody's saying, I experience itchy skin when I eat gluten. So again, you want to ask, why are you responding to it that way? What part of it is causing you to respond that way? Is it the protein? Is it the carbohydrate? Is it the pesticide? What would cause that? All right, perfect. And then
we have another question talking about yeast. What are your thoughts on nutritional yeast? That's a good one.
Generally, I will say, so nutritional yeast is naturally gluten-free. So if you're wondering if it's gluten-free, it is. Nutritional yeast is a great source of plant protein. It could be a source of B vitamins. It has some iron in it, other minerals. So as a whole, it's nutritionally dense. If you are somebody who is curious, if you have a fungal overgrowth and you feel really unwell after you eat nutritional yeast, and you notice that you have symptoms like a white coating on your tongue, you notice that your skin gets very itchy, maybe you have dandruff after you eat it, eczema, dermatitis, you get really stuffy in your nose or your ears, maybe you experience itching elsewhere, maybe you don't do as well with nutritional yeast, brain fog, fatigue. But, you know, we eat nutritional yeast in our house, and it's something that we use, and it's something gluten-free. So it could be great. All right.
Okay.
Well,
all right, everybody.
Really great questions that everybody had. We always love engaging in these conversations with you all. And we appreciate you showing up here and asking these questions. And we hope that all these topics really give additional insight into these, what can be very convoluted things. Confusing things, because I think you hear things on both sides, and we've heard things on both sides, right? You have the people who are like, if you don't have a very strict autoimmune reaction to it, eat it, even if it doesn't make you feel your best. And then you have people on the other side who say, it's evil, never eat it. You should never be eating gluten. So we hope that this provided you clarity, and it provided you with the information for you to then make an informed decision for yourself and say, all right, this got me thinking. I want to try some different ways, different forms, different foods. And I want to continue to try to heal with each meal and feel with each meal. So I see what works best for me and what does not.
All right, everybody. Until next time, again, this is our monthly Good Gut Live, and we do also a dietitian talk once a month. So join us. You can find all of our videos and talks and recordings if you want to watch this later on our YouTube channel at Married to Health. So thank you all so much, and we appreciate you. Have a great rest of the day.
Bye.
Bye.